All right, so today we're going to be moving into exponents. First of all, here, let me talk about some rules in exponents. One of them, we're going to call it the product rule. As an example for the product rule, what we're going to be doing is, let's say we have x to the third times x to the second. And x is just the base, right? The base, as long as it's the same thing, it could be a numbered, it could be a lettered, anything, as long as it is the same. I know x to the third technically means I'm multiplying x 3 times. So I have x times x times x. And then x to the second basically means I'm also going to multiply x again 2 more times. So x and x. Keep in mind, this is 3 because x to the third, and there's 2 more because of x to the second. Now, the interesting part is I can simplify. I means I can shrink it. It seems I'm multiplying x, right? X is what I keep on multiplying. So let me just keep an x. But I notice I can always count. I notice that I have x 5 times. So I'm going to simplify this to x to the 5th. Now, interesting part of the product rule, it says, looking at the numbers 3 and 2, we could have come out with the 5 initially if we would just add the exponents. So in multiplication, so when we're multiplying, you're just going to add the exponents. Now, the power rule, let me take a look at this power rule thing, this next rule. Let's say I had 2x and y to the second, and all of this to the third power. Now, power rule, basically, we're going to have a parentheses and we're going to have an exponent on the outside. Now, the power rule basically means I have 2 times x times y to the second 3 times. So let me just write this thing down 3 times. Notice I wrote 2xy to the second 3 times. Basically what I had inside the parentheses, and I wrote it 3 times because the exponent was 3. But then I know how to multiply. I look at my whole numbers here, 2 times 2 times 2. For right now, let me just call this 2 to the third for right now. Basically, I have 2 3 times. Then I take a look at my x's. I see there's one x, there's another x, there's another x. Technically, I have x to the third. I have x 3 times. And then I take a look at the y's. There's y to the second, y to the second, y to the second. And I just learned in the product rule that I'm just going to add the exponents. So that's going to give me y to the 6. Now, interesting part on the power rule. Power rule states, to begin with, make sure everything inside of the parentheses has an exponent. Make sure everything has an exponent. If you don't see it, count it as a 1. So technically I had a 2 to the 1, x to the 1, and y to the 2. And then the power rule says, multiply the exponent on the outside times the exponents on the inside. Notice I could have just done that. And that would have given me 2 to the third, x to the third, y to the 6th. So power rule says, make sure everything has an exponent. And then the exponent on the outside multiplied to the exponents on the inside. And then when it comes to numbers, 2 to the third, that one we can simplify. My answer here will be 8, x to the third, y to the 6th. Numbers can be simplified. 2 to the third, basically multiplying 2 times 2 times 2, right? 2 3 times. So that gives me 8. All right, so now that we know the rules, let's take a look. This is how our work is going to look like. So first of all, we're using the product rule. So I'm just looking at numbers. I'm just looking at my numbers here, then I'm going to say, all right, -3 times a -3. Now, -3 times a -3 gives me 9. I'm just looking at the whole numbers. And then I'm going to look at my letters in alphabetical order. So I see A to the fourth, and that's the only A that I have. So I'm just going to write A to the fourth. And then I'm going to look at my B's. And I know in multiplication, I'm just going to add the exponents. So that's going to give me B to the 6. So again, first I started with the whole numbers, and then I went on my letters alphabetical order. Now the question might be, how am I going to type this? Now we're going to write the 9 is just a 9. A to the fourth, we're going to use an A. Then we have this little arrow that we call it caret, A to the fourth. And then we're going to do B to the 6. That little caret, you guys have to press shift and then the number 6. Make sure you guys have your keyboard as a US keyboard. Don't go international to get the exponent. Don't go international. Make sure you guys have it as a US keyboard. So it's just 9, A to the fourth, B to the 6. The way we're going to be typing exponents is using that little caret, like the one on the number 6. So this is how it gets typed in. All right, let's take a look at question number 3. First of all, I start with my whole numbers only. There's a -3. Then my letters, I'm going to treat them in alphabetical order. So then I have x's. I have x to the third, x to the third, and I know I must add the exponents. So that gives me x to the 6. And then when it comes to the y's, I'm going to get y to the 5th. I'm adding my exponents. And the way we're going to type this, a -3, x to the 6, y to the 5th. Use that caret. Use that little arrow that looks on number 6. We call it caret. Use that for exponent. It's all together, no spaces, all together. All right, let's take a look at question number 4. When it comes to whole numbers, I have a -4 times 2. So it's going to give me -8. My letters, I'm going to treat them in alphabetical order. So I see m to the fourth, m to the third. So that's going to give me m to the 7th. I must add my exponents. Then when it comes to n, I just see n to the 2nd. That's my only n that I see, so n to the 2nd. The way I'm going to type this will be -8 m to the 7th, n to the 2nd. Hopefully you guys are like, oh, this is not that bad. Let's take a look at one more of these. Looking at number 5. When it comes to the whole numbers, -2 times -3. I know negative times negative is positive, so it gives me +6. When it comes to letters, I only have x to the third and x to the third. So that's going to give me x to the 6th because I must add my exponent. The way I'm going to type this will be 6x to the 6th. And then we move into the parentheses, right? I call this the power rule. I remember for this one, I said, make sure every number inside the parentheses has an exponent. So I'm going to have -3 to the 1 and x to the 1. Everything must have an exponent. I'm going to multiply the exponent on the outside to the exponents on the inside. So I have my -3 to the 2nd powered. I have x to the 2nd powered. And I have y to the 4th. Notice the exponent on the outside, I multiplied it to the exponents on the inside. So I know -3 squared, right? -3 times -3, that's 9. So I have 9x squared, y to the 4th. So my answer will be, that's how I'm going to type this. I'm going to go 9 x to the second, y to the fourth. Now I have a question here. Do we have to put a space in between the two variables? No, it's all together. All together. No spaces in there. All together. All right, let's take a look at number 7. First of all, make sure there's an exponent on the inside for everything. So I have 4 to the 1. Everything must have an exponent. And then the exponent on the outside, I'm going to multiply to the inside. So I have 4 to the 4th, m to the 16, n to the 16th. I'm multiplying my numbers. Now, when it comes to numbers, 4 to the 4th, I'm going to multiply it. 4 times 4 times 4 times 4, right? 4 times. So that's going to give me 256 m to the 16th, n to the 16th. Now, the way I'm going to type this, 256 m to the 16th, n to the 16th. For exponents, we're going to use that caret. We call it caret. Let me take a look at a couple more rules of these. This negative sign on the front, basically that means a -1. Right? When we don't see it numbered, we're going to see it as a 1. So I'm going to see that that -1 has an exponent of 1. Because everything must have an exponent. So I have a -1 squared, x to the 6th, and y to the 4th. Because the exponent on the outside, the 2, I multiplied it to the exponents on the inside. And I know -1 squared, right? -1 times -1. For right now, let me call it +1, x to the 6th, y to the 4th. When we're writing our numbers in multiplication, because technically this is all multiplication, in multiplication, the 1 is irrelevant. So you don't have to type it in. My answer will just be x to the 6th, y to the 4th. The 1 at the very front, you don't have to type it in. And then lastly, question number 9. Everything in the inside of the parentheses must have an exponent. If you don't see it, put a 1. You're going to multiply the exponent on the outside to the exponents on the inside. So that's going to give me 3 to the 3rd, a to the 12th, b to the 6th. The exponent on the outside gets multiplied to the exponents on the inside. Now, 3 to the 3rd, I know that's 27, right? 3 times 3 times 3. That's 27. So my answer will be 27th, a to the 12th, b to the 6th. Mathematically speaking, the order of the letters doesn't matter. But in order for all of us to have the same answer, I'm going to ask you guys to please go in alphabetical order. When it comes to letters, do in alphabetical order. Now, another rule that we're going to have, let's say another rule. We're going to call this the division rule. Let me make an example. Let's say I had x to the 7th over x to the 3. So I'm going to be dividing now. I have a fraction, because a fraction means division. On the top, I have x 7 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. At the bottom, I have x 3 times. X times x times x. The funny thing is that factors, right? Factors are things that are being multiplied. When we have common factors in a fraction, right? One on top, one at the bottom, we can just cancel them out. So there's one x from each. There's another x and there's another x. Basically, I cross out 3 x's from each. I don't have anything at the bottom, so it's not a fraction anymore. But I notice that what I have left over, I have x 4 times. Now, the rule states, as long as it is the same base, I'm going to subtract my exponents. I remember for multiplication, I added the exponents. In this case, I'm going to subtract the exponents. If my result is a positive, right, 7 minus 3, I'm not going to have a fraction. Now, the interesting part is that what if I had x to the second over x to the fourth? So an example, let's take a look at that. I have 2 x's on the top. I have 4 x's at the bottom. I cancel out my common factors. But in this case, I have an x to the second at the bottom. The top, I cannot leave it empty. So we're still going to subtract our exponents. But when our result is a positive, looking at my first example, 7 minus 3 is 4. It is not a fraction. But looking at my second example, 2 minus 4 is a negative 2. So when our exponents happen to be negatives, we're still going to write them at the bottom. We're going to write them with whatever the bigger exponent was. So if the big exponent was on the top, write them on top. If the big exponent was at the bottom, write it at the bottom. Okay, what do I mean with that? Let's take a look. Now, to begin with, I'm going to look at my numbers. I'm going to do a fraction, and I see my 2 over 4. My fractions, I can simplify my fractions. Let me divide each by 2. So 2 divided by 2 is 1. 4 divided by 2 is 2. I divide them by the same thing. So number-wise, my fraction can be simplified to 1 over 2. Letter-wise, when it comes to A, I just have an A to the 4 at the bottom. That's the only A that I have. When it comes to B's, I have 1 on the top and 1 at the bottom. And I'm going to subtract them. I'm going to subtract my numbers. 3 minus 2 is 1. The big exponent was on the top, so I'm going to have a B to the 1 on the top. Notice how my exponent I chose not to write. All right, the 1 we don't have to write. So that's it. My answer is just going to be B over 2A to the 4th. Right, the 1 on the top, again, is optional. And my 1 as an exponent is optional. Now, how are we going to type fractions? The way we're going to type fractions, we're going to use the backslash. The backslash, you guys see it at the bottom right of your keyboard. Anything that comes before the backslash is what goes on the top of the fraction. Anything that comes after it is what goes at the bottom. So this one, the way I would want to type this will be B backslash 2A to the 4th. Again, anything before the backslash is what goes on the top of the fraction. Anything that comes after it is what is at the bottom of the fraction. Now, if there is a negative sign, whether it's at the top or the bottom, we're just going to bring it to the very front of the fraction. So again, if there is a negative sign, I'm going to bring it to the front of the fraction. Okay, let's take a look at this. I'm going to simplify first. Numbers-wise, I see a 4 and a 4. They cancel out. Letter-wise, when it comes to x's, I'm going to subtract them. 4 minus 4 is 0, so they cancel out. So it seems like I only have a y to the second at the bottom. And I have a negative sign on the front of my fraction. Now, the top of my fraction cannot be empty. So empty spaces, I fill it out with a 1. So my answer for this one will be a negative sign, 1 over y to the second. And again, if there's a negative sign, we bring it to the front. We use backslash for fractions. So that's how I'm going to type this out. Let me do a couple more. I'm going to do up to number 18, I said. So let's take a look at number 13. So it is a fraction. When it comes to numbers, I only see a 4 at the bottom. When it comes to m's, because I'm going to treat them in alphabetical order, when it comes to m, I subtract my exponents. And 2 minus 3 or 3 minus 2 is 1. I'm subtracting the exponents. So I'm going to have m to the 1 at the bottom. Remember, we write it whatever the bigger exponent is. The bigger exponent is at the bottom, so we write it at the bottom. When it comes to n's, I subtract my exponents. I get n to the 1, and I'm also going to write it at the bottom. because the bigger exponent was at the bottom. The top cannot stay empty, so I'm just going to put right at 1. My answer with this would be 1 over 4mn. And then lastly, looking at number 14, when I say lastly for this rule, if I have a fraction, I see a negative sign in front of the fraction, number-wise, 3 over 2, nothing I can do. If I could divide them by the same thing to make my number smaller, do so. But in this one, we cannot. When it comes to the x's, x to the 4th and x to the 4th, right, I subtract my exponents. 4 minus 4 is 0. So there's no more x's. When it comes to y, the y at the bottom, technically it is y to the 1. I subtract my exponents. So I'm going to have a y to the 1 on the top. I subtract my exponents. 2 minus 1 is 1, but the bigger exponent was on top. So I put the y on the top. The way I'm going to type this out will be a negative 3y over 2. Anything before the backslash is what goes on the top. Anything after the backslash is what goes at the bottom. If there's a negative sign, bring it to the very front. Now, interesting part, we're going to look at 2 rules here. The 0 exponent. If I had an x to the 7th or x to the 3, let's go x to the 3 times x to the 0. I know I can add my exponents, so that gives me x to the 3. Technically, the x to the 0 did nothing. So we're going to say that x to the 0 was technically a 1. Right? In multiplication, the number that does nothing is a 1 in multiplication. So anything to the 0 is going to be 1. Anything to the 0 is going to be 1. Now, our negative exponents. Negative exponents, we have that x to the 7th, let's say x to the 7th, times x to the negative 2. I know that gives me x to the 5. However, the way I could have written this, I could have just written this as x to the 7th over x to the 2. I know that also gives me x to the 5. A negative exponent, we're going to make it positive on the other side. So if it is a negative on the top, bring it as a positive to the bottom. If it's a negative at the bottom, bring it as a positive to the top. A negative exponent is going to be positive on the other side. And when I say sides, I mean the top side or the bottom side. So let's start. We're going to start combining a few rules here. First of all, let me get rid of parentheses. So I'm going to say that the 2 p m to the 4th n to the negative 2, outside of the parentheses, I'm going to leave it alone. This negative sign at the very front is basically negative 1. So now for parentheses, I see a negative 1 to the 1. So I'm going to have a negative 1 squared m to the negative 2, m to the 8, n to the 6, and p to the 8. Notice a negative 2 on my exponent on the outside. I multiplied it to all of my exponents. Negative 1. Let me take a look at a negative 1 to the negative 2. That basically becomes a negative 1 squared at the bottom. The top cannot be empty. But the funny thing is a negative 1 times a negative 1 is 1. So all this is just 1. But in multiplication, a 1 is useless. So I'm going to ignore this. Now, the way I'm going to come out with my answer, number-wise, I have a 2. Letter-wise, let me go in alphabetical order. Now, here I have a question. For the fraction problems, are you able to subtract a to the 4, b to the 4 from b squared, a squared? Yes, you're supposed to be able to subtract those. Our question is a to the fourth, b to the fourth, and at the bottom, b squared. Remember, you subtract the exponents and keep it where the bigger exponent was. Okay, now coming back to number 16. So number-wise, I just have a 2. Letter-wise, like I said, I'm going to start in alphabetical order. To begin with, I'm going to have m to the 12. Notice I added the exponents on m. And then I have n to the 4. Right? -2 plus 6 is +4. And then p to the 9. Notice I added my exponent. Remember, the p at the very beginning technically is a p to the 1. So the way I'm going to type this, I'm going to do 2 m to the 12, n to the 4th, and p to the 9. The nice thing is that they were all positive exponents. Sometimes I'm going to deal with negative exponents. If we have negative exponents, bring it to the bottom of a fraction. I said earlier, when we have negative exponents, make it positive on the other side. So let's take a look at number 17. To begin with, the negative sign is a -1. I'm going to distribute the -1 to all of my exponents. There's a z to the 1, a -1 to the 1. So I have a -1 to the -1, a z to the -1, x to the -3, and y to the -4th. Because I multiplied -1 to my exponents on the inside. And then I still have a negative x to the -4th, y to the -1, and z to the 3rd. What I had outside of the parentheses. Interesting part is that a -1 to the -1, that's a -1. So looking at numbers wise, -1 times a negative sign become +1. Now, I'm not going to worry about writing it. In multiplication, 1 is useless. So I'm going to say they cancel out. I'm not going to write it. When it comes to letters, let me go alphabetical order. So I have x to the -7th. I have a y to the -5. And then I have a z to the 2nd. Now I see my answers. There's some negatives, but my instructions, it says your answer should contain only positive exponents. So if I was to write this, I'm going to write a fraction. The z to the 2nd stays on the top because z is positive, but my negatives are going to come to the bottom. X to the 7th, y to the 5th. Remember I said earlier, any negative exponent becomes positive on the other side. So if it's negative on the top, then I guess make a fraction and bring it to the bottom. The way I'm going to type this, z to the 2nd over x to the 7th, y to the 5th. Oh, forgot that the way I'm going to type this, x to the 7th, y to the 5th. I know I said I was going to do alphabetical order. And if you notice, they are in alphabetical order at the bottom. The z comes before the x and the y because the z comes on the top of the fraction. All right, let's take a look at one more example. This negative sign is basically a -1. So I have -1 to the -2nd, z to the -2, x to the -6, and y to the +6. Notice the -2, I multiply to my exponents on the inside. I still have times y, x squared, z squared. So when it comes to numbers, I know -1 to the -2 is basically, it's a fraction. It's a -1 square at the bottom, right? It's negative on the top, so bring it to the bottom. But that -1 squared is basically 1. 1 squared is just 1. So I want to say all this is just useless. I'm not going to worry about writing it. Now, when it comes to letters, let me go in alphabetical order. When it comes to X, I'm going to add my exponent, so that gives me X to the negative 4th. When it comes to Y, that gives me Y to the 7th. Remember, the Y by itself is basically Y to the 1. And then when it comes to Z, it's Z to the 0. So I'm not going to even, for right now, let me just write Z to the 0. All right, so Z to the 0 is 1, and I said multiplication 1 is useless. So Z to the 0, I'm not going to write. I see there's a negative exponent, so that's going to go to the bottom. So if I was to write this, I will write Y to the 7th over X to the 4th. Notice I brought X to the 4th to the bottom if I was to write it. Now, if I'm going to type it, I'm going to go Y to the 7th over X to the 4th. Let me zoom out. That way you guys can see exactly what we did. You guys can take a screenshot of it. Right there. Make sure you guys take screenshots if possible.